I haven't had the chance to put those into practice in my work. But I do hope moving forward that there's space to talk about those things, especially because my current work is connected to a lot of rural health initiatives. We just launched a PhD for Indigenous health, which is the first one. And it'll be interesting and fun to see sort of what frameworks are relevant in our context. But so does anyone else have any personal experience with any of the things discussed in the readings within archives land or data land, research creation, or preservation of documents?
So I sort of do, this is Nick. It's not directly related to Indigenous groups, but they're affected. So I work in healthcare. I'm on a team in our organization of 15,000 employees, and the team is 5 people who are rolling out how we are training everyone, you know, because that'll happen in any feasible amount of time, and eventually collecting information on sexual orientation and gender identity for patients. And the article, I think it was the Allison Mills one, that talked about how having information on people gives you a lot of power, how we struggle with making sure that how we collect this information and how we train people to collect the information in the clinical setting, and how to kind of disclose to patients that when they give us this information, even though, you know, you're protected by HIPAA, there's a lot of privacy that goes into it. Anyone who has a reason to be caring for you medically will have access to it. And for a lot of people, sexual orientation and gender identity, having people know that information can be dangerous. And so it's been, reading the Allison Mills article kind of made me think in that framework how I know when I was younger, I was really interested in, you know, free access to information. It would be great if everyone could just access anything whenever they wanted. But that there are a lot of people for whom that sort of access to information can pose a huge danger. And how do we balance that? So it was kind of an aside, but it made me think really deeply about that and how that impacts my work in a similar but different kind of realm.
I don't really think that's an aside. I think you're totally right in terms of, and it almost takes a different layer of labor, which is part of why it's hard to get these things to happen, right? It's additional work on top of doing your job and following the regular policies. Challenging things is really difficult. And it also requires something we've talked about before in terms of knowledge of your institution and how things work and how new policies can be implemented, who's in charge of that, you know, how do I even check to see if there is a policy? Am I going to rock the boat when I do that? Do you feel, Nick, like that is more risky in either healthcare institutions or corporate institutions than it would be in academia?
I'm not sure, potentially, because as much as, you know, healthcare workers don't want to admit it, there is a lot of bigotry in healthcare. You know, where doctors, nurses, other healthcare, like allied health, we are derived from the general population. We have the same kind of mix of beliefs as other people. And I think in a way, maybe more than academia and other places do, is we have not direct control over people's well-being, but we are absolutely gatekeepers who already wield an enormous amount of power over people's lives. And a lot of healthcare providers don't want to admit that. And I think that combination of things can be pretty dangerous. And like, there's a lot of negative outcomes that come from people not recognizing how much power we have over people's well-being.
It's a follow-on to that, and this is really for everyone that works with data. And yeah, Rachel, thanks so much for sharing all the links in the chat. That's super, super helpful. And Devin, you too. Yeah, y'all are so fast. Yeah, just as a follow-on, I'm curious for anyone, like, who in the group had seen the CARE principles before, even just been exposed to them, and maybe through RDA or like a listserv or something like that. And then for people that hadn't seen the CARE principles before, I'm curious with some of the specific issues that Nick just brought up, how does that strike you? Like if you weren't already familiar, and to Devin's question too, about like, what does it mean to incorporate these different considerations, to bake them in to how we approach data collection and synthesis? Like, what does it mean institutionally or organizationally? I'm just curious, maybe Nick, if you could start, but also what others' reactions to the CARE principles were. And if you think, Nick, especially, if some of those principles address some of the issues that you just enumerated, and number two, how they would actually be applied, or how you could see them being applied in your work on information systems or data collection and synthesis.
So unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to reread the CARE principles. I've read them in the past. I don't remember exactly why, but I think it was something related to maintainers. I saw them, looked at them, but didn't reread them. So I don't remember what the principles are exactly. But
no, that's okay. Actually,
yeah.
that's totally fine, Nick. I'm just curious kind of in general then, if you feel like, maybe the better question is, how do you see incorporating some of these concerns and sort of like due diligence effectively in our role as like information professionals? Like, how do you see incorporating some of those or baking some of those things into the work that you do, or the healthcare sector, and the kind of work that you do within the healthcare sector?
Yeah, so I think one of really the big things that I try to do in my work, especially with patient care, but also I'm trying to encourage our group to do this in some ways, is to relinquish control. And I don't mean like not kind of like utilize the best practices, but the group of people in our organization who are the ones responsible for education and spearheading the rollout of this data collection. There are 5 of us. Every single one of us is white. We are all straight. We're all cisgendered. And it's just like all of us kind of fell into it. It's not our primary jobs. It's just there was a decision made that this was going to happen, and we were the people that the organization happened to find who were going to be involved in this, who had the skill sets and the time. And a lot of it is that we don't have a lot of people who are out in our organization, despite them making probably above average attempts at being a safe place. You know, there's still a lot of concerns people have. And that we try to incorporate a lot of community involvement in our decision-making. We have some groups we work very closely with. They often don't agree with each other on best practice. We work with some national organizations and follow their guidelines, but it's hard to get people to understand that this is a decision patients have to make. And if they can't tell us or don't want to tell us things, that needs to be okay. Just because there's reasons it can be really important to know someone's sexual orientation and gender identity, because there are parts of medical care that depend on knowing those things. We can't be the people who decide if we need to know that or not. And I think in general, when you're part of the hierarchy in most organizations, it's hard to let go of being the decision maker on whether or not something is necessary. But I think it is one of the most important things we can do.
Thank you so much for that, Nick. That's so awesome, that point that you're making. Yeah, about where the real decision-making power lies and how that comes into direct conflict with the kind of maximalist collection approach that I think we're sort of talking about as like the status quo in these efforts. And it's also maybe based slightly on the justification that we never know like what's going to emerge in terms of correlation, even though we've crafted our research question or the thing that we're trying to find out about in a particular way. Yeah, I'll just reiterate that, yeah, really thinking critically, having oneself, like myself in my own practice, where we collect a lot of data from communities, we work with them on synthesizing that data into like actionable next steps. But there is a lot of data collection and synthesis that is also happening, and questions that are being crafted on the facilitation side. And so I think just in my own personal practice, navigating through and learning how to be critical about where kind of like how much data do you really need effectively is what it comes down to, as opposed to a maximalist approach that would support like, well, we don't know, you know, so we'll just collect as much as we can, and then inductively, you know, we'll suss out what's meaningful there. And I think that's just not good enough in terms of a rationale. So yeah, being critical in one's own practice about that's really powerful, Nick. Thank you.
I think I would really agree to that also. It speaks to me a lot in terms of education and teaching students both that they have agency over their own information. Well, not both. Also that it's being collected, where it goes, what happens to it. And also, because my students are healthcare workers, how do you find authoritative information about a community? What does authoritative look like? You know, they're being trained to only respect articles in like PubMed. So then when they're trying to work with a tribe, you know, they get really frustrated that there's no articles about Turtle Mountain in PubMed. So like, how do you tell them like, well, this definition of authoritative actually, like you have to back up and do like a history lesson. And I think a lot of that, it takes self-awareness of the system and your role in it. Rachel, I'd be curious to hear if you have if you have noticed any of this in your work. You said you're an archivist at New York University?
Yes.
Yeah, in terms of, I'm thinking about patrons right now, in terms of access, is that ever an issue for you?
So yeah, like a lot of things people have just been talking about have really resonated with me. And I, in my current role, am like a technical services archivist, so I don't really have much direct contact with our patrons at this moment. And we're definitely like at NYU having a moment where a lot of us are, you know, really trying to come together and put a lot of these ideas that are gaining headway in our communities. Yes, I do write finding aids. So into practice and really turn them into action. So we've been talking a lot about, you know, how to make our descriptions more ethical, more inclusive, how to deal with the legacy metadata that we have that does harm. And so, yeah, we've been talking a lot about that. And we don't have a lot of Indigenous collection material here, but we do have a lot of other material that I think is very sensitive to other marginalized communities. And these articles and other things have been making me think of just how principles like this, the care principles or the protocols for Native American archival materials, like how implementing those and really taking those to heart provides us a way to really recenter these communities and these individuals. And I think like Nick was saying, whether it's, you want to call it collaboration or sharing power or ceding power, just really be cognizant of those power dynamics and the relationships, and maybe let go of a lot of our maybe traditional training in whatever profession we're in of, you know, what the hard and fast rules are. Maybe those don't have to be hard and fast. Like we should, you know, be more flexible, or, you know, do away with them entirely in order to actually engage in these relationships with different communities and treat their materials with care. And that might even include not collecting material or giving back material. So yeah, like we've been having a lot of conversations kind of around similar issues, and really trying to center the experience of the individuals and communities, and kind of take a practice of care approach. So, yeah.
Yeah, I really liked how the articles gave examples of that in practice in terms of giving the power back to the community, ways that you can make archival collections sort of closed and the community has access to that, and then that feeds into a separate public archive. Community can decide what goes out into the world. And I think you're completely right in terms of thinking who has the power. And it's hard to think of yourself as not collecting as being the appropriate archival thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like at other times in my career, like have taken like maybe really dogmatic approaches or been in environments where it's like everything needs to be open, access is the most important thing, and like seeing that as an absolute good, and just really needing to be more cognizant of other understandings and other cultural models of that, and that, you know, that can actually be really harmful and really disrespectful. So just kind of unlearning certain like truisms that have either kind of been swirling around or have been handed down, and interrogating them, I think, is really important.
Rachel, okay, so on the very closely aligned with the readings that Devin and Jordan shared with us for this week, but not specific to Indigenous communities, but communities outside of the academy, knowledge production communities outside of the academy, and specifically the relationship, the power dynamics. Rachel, this is in direct response to everything that you just described. Y'all may be very familiar with TK Sangwan's work. She's currently at UCLA, but she used to be at UT Austin, and she was the human rights archivist there. And TK has written quite a bit. I just shared a link to her Preservation is Political. And she talks about contributive justice specifically in the context of the power dynamics between universities that are universities and models for thinking about what the relationship to knowledge production communities in situ should be. So directly to your point, Rachel, about does it make sense for institutions, memory institutions embedded in higher ed institutions, to think to themselves that there's some sort of there's some sort of like authoritative hierarchy there? And this gets back to what Devin was describing. That, okay, well, communities can generate stuff, but ultimately, like, if it's going to be cared for and it's going to have like meaningful access, then surely it has to be kind of recontextualized or put into the service model of the institution as kind of like a baseline assumption there. And so, yeah, that article gets at specifically TK's work in Cuba with knowledge production communities, but also communities that are curating their own materials, like the Pachete, which is like a hard drive where there's stuff from the internet that people download onto it and then it gets passed around. And so her reflecting on using like post-custodial archiving model for thinking about how universities can sit in relationship to these communities, that they're not collecting like the actual material, but maybe they are providing some digitized service for a subset of those materials, that there's some advantage to the community to have a backup copy hosted somewhere. And an example of that is actually in the Human Rights Documentation Initiative collection at UT Austin. So like one of the sub collections within that, and I'll link to it here, is like the genocide, the Rwandan genocide archive. So it's there are police documents in there, and things that are effectively like evidence of wrongdoing and human rights violations. So there are situations like that where you can see that there's kind of like this technological backup and agreement that could go on. But there are many different models for how, yeah, communities outside of the academy and the academy interrelate when it comes to collection and recontextualization of those materials. And actually, I know Tara can speak to this too, having kind of an affiliation with a university in terms of her data collective. So yeah, that Rachel, 100,000%. And I just wanted to share that if y'all haven't read TK's work before.
Thank you. I haven't read that piece in particular, so thank you for sharing that.
All of that was so great, Jess. Thank you. All I can keep thinking about is baseline assumptions. And it's also very interesting because it's like you don't realize, you know, the structure that's undergirding what you do, like Western legal convention, you know, guiding the hierarchy of what we think intellectual property is, and that being based on value, which was one of the concepts in the readings that I thought was the most interesting, because it seems like both in the world of data and in the world of archives, what makes something successful in terms of being community driven rather than top down driven by the university is ownership. Belonging with the community that creates the material. And that's the O in OCAP. And I think that it's also part of the CARE principles for Indigenous knowledge and research and data. I'm finding it hard to like figure out what thread I want to follow up on that with. Ross, I wanted to ask you, I'm going to pick on you as the person who is not in a Western, you're like our foreign correspondent. Is it also like, is it as much a problem? Like I assume that in the United States, of course, we're very consumed with value and intellectual property, and you know, Disney controlling copyright, and we talk a lot about copyright, and it's tied to, you know, how you use something, but not the inherent thing itself. In your experience working in various places, is that always the same?
I don't know. I actually don't think I have the skills to answer it, I'm afraid, Devon. I'm finding this in this conversation, I guess I look upon myself as an enabler for a lot of this, so I rely on other people to sort of guide me there, like, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So I don't know.
Well, and I think that's an especially appropriate response too, because when I'm just beginning to dive into this, which is why I have more questions than answers, but it seems like what's the most successful is initiatives that are collaborations between universities and other institutions. Like OCAP was, it seems to me, started because of some government initiatives and some communities came up with this. First Nations, FN governmental, FN, see if I can remember the acronym, FNGIC. And the CARE principles, similarly, a coalition of people. And the things that have been useful in guiding usage of racial terminology in public health research, like it has to be many bodies of people coming together. It seems like that's what's necessary, because none of us has the time, like it's not somebody's job, unfortunately, to do this. That's something that we're working on in a project that I'm doing, where we're trying to make sure that the terminology used in research articles is consistent. As Lauren was talking about earlier, like if you mark Hispanic, like that's the end of the road. You can't be Black and Hispanic. So like, what if that's who you're trying, what if that's the community that you're trying to serve? What if you're Indigenous and Hispanic? Like, why can't you be both of those things? Why can you be non-Hispanic white, but you can't be Hispanic white? Is that what I want to say? Yes. But we're going to have to come up with a coalition between publishers, people who work at universities, people who are carrying out the research at institutions that are not academic, and also the editorial boards themselves. And I think that's part of what makes it difficult. And maybe that's why archives are able to come up with sort of practices. So I think context matters a little bit, but we need coalitions of people.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that, if you decide that, one of the things that strikes me in what you were saying about, if you decide that actively collecting is your strategy, then if there are biases still in society that still impact not just Indigenous communities, but impoverished communities and minorities, then there's still a Western bias towards education. And so if you have people in archives who are skilled in things like collection care, or repairing old documents, or doing digital preservation. You know, I think one of the ways that collecting institutions can contribute to these coalitions is to send their specialists out in those fields to maybe help with collecting, with helping other communities collect. I think you've seen it with, I forget who the authors are, but Jared Drake's one of them in that is it a police violence database in Cleveland, and the concept, it's like around community archives. It's enabling other people to do the collecting and do the care of their material for themselves. And anyway, but to my point, I think we can be part of this coalition by sending our best specialists out and then helping other people, enabling other people to do the work.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And that's part of the work as a professional, right, is to learn about people who are doing these things. I just put a link to what I think you were talking about in there. And I think that Stephanie, I keep getting her last name confused. Carol Russo, is one of those folks who seems to have been in the research world and ended up sort of becoming a specialist in care principles. We spoke previously, this might have been in an email, about historical reenactors becoming sort of the specialists in terms of the intersection of history, modern day racial violence, and their way of educating people and being specialists and consulting with historical institutions is through the medium of reenactment, which I think is maybe on the opposite side. It's like visceral, whereas these policies are to guide future work. And those are both probably necessary.
Devin, I just wanted to, in case some people can't look at the chat, I wanted to share, this is from 2019, but the first issue of the Cultural Analytics Journal includes several articles that get right at some of the topics that have come up today, especially intersectional data, which Lauren brought up earlier in relation to the census. And also, I can forward this like event invitation that just came in that is talking about the McKinsey-fication of the state. And just to connect that to what we've been talking about, like where do these maximalist data collection approaches come from? I think that it's related to much broader trends of just like commercialization and outsourcing of a lot of like government entities, such that the model that we follow even within publicly funded institutions is more of a corporate model and a way of thinking about just like how to maximize value, so, and productivity and efficiency. And Devin, this is something that you kind of brought up earlier, which is just how big value plays and a lot of the things that people were reflecting on in terms of like what maybe does not translate or does not translate and ends up being exploitative, or it ends up leading to exploitative practices. So anyway, this is, I can forward this, but it seems kind of further afield, but I think that it might be useful to connect some of these broader like macro social trends to some of these like information maintenance trends.
No, I think that's a really good point, Jess, especially, you know, we're seeing personal data become more and more monetized. And so like the lines of what is archived are blurring a little bit in terms of importance, and high publishers who are very large and making a lot of money buying things for data, right? Ownership and value. It makes me think about counting things, even in academia. You're totally right, Jess, in terms of like how many things we upload, how many reference questions we answer, and necessarily then you're not focused on the value of that encounter. And you see it in healthcare too, right? Like you have counts for how many people you are supposed to serve on your chart.
Right, because funding is dependent on all of those proxy indicators of, to your point, Devin, quality, when really what you're just talking about is, yeah, like some sort of monetary value.
Mm-hmm.
But I just forwarded that one to you, Devin, and when you do the wrap up, if you want to include it, it's there.
Yes, thank you. I will totally do that. And if anyone has additional, oh my goodness, it's 10:56. If anyone has any additional resources, please send them along. This is one of those instances where there were probably like a couple of things that are canon, but there's so much that's happening because this is necessarily grassroots. I really appreciate you all coming, sharing a little bit about your personal experience. I know that it's very much a learning journey for me. You know, I have a lot of questions that I'm embarrassed to ask and not sure how to articulate. And I appreciate all of you maybe being vulnerable about those things. Next time we will have a couple of speakers. We have 2 that are confirmed and we're adjusting the date, but I'll be sending out their bios and as well as sort of how we're going to guide the panel so that if you have questions, you can figure out how they fit in. Other than that, we hope to see you all October 16th.
Awesome. Yeah, really looking forward to it. Thanks, everyone. Just to reiterate Devin's comment, yeah, this was a great conversation, and thanks to everyone for being willing to share.
Thank you, Devin. I don't know. It doesn't feel like an easy discussion to lead. So you're doing great. Like, thank you for leading.
Well, thank you, Ross.
Agreed. Yeah, here.
Yes, definitely.
I mean, information maintainers are a fabulous group of kind thinkers. So it's fun to be here. Cool, everybody. Have an excellent weekend. Please absorb some fine weather and do some self-care.
Sounds like a plan.
All right.
We're going to end on time, everyone. Thank you. See you later.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.